On that February day in 1944, the 19th to be precise, deep within the underground command facility at Rabaul on New Britain, Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka found his hand shaking as he committed thoughts to paper in his private journal that could have resulted in charges of treason had anyone from Imperial headquarters discovered them. What he wrote was simple, yet devastating in its implications. The enemy was not engaging Japanese forces in traditional combat. They were suffocating them, methodically and deliberately. Every garrison that the Americans chose to bypass became another anchor dragging the Empire deeper beneath the waves. The sound of American B-24 Liberators penetrated even into his bunker through the ventilation shafts, that daily aerial parade that had become as predictable as the sunrise ever since the Americans made their calculated decision that Rabaul simply was not worth the cost of invasion. 100,000 Japanese troops, representing some of the finest soldiers the Imperial Army and Navy could field, sat uselessly on this volcanic rock, reduced to spectators as American convoys sailed past them on their way toward the Japanese home islands. This base, Rabaul, had been transformed into a major fleet installation and stood as the most heavily fortified Japanese position throughout the entire South Pacific. Yet it was being systematically rendered impotent without a single amphibious assault. What Kusaka witnessed from his bunker, and what filled him with a terror far exceeding any fear of frontal assault or naval bombardment, was an entirely new form of warfare that made all of Japanese defensive thinking completely obsolete. The Americans had abandoned the traditional rules of engagement. They were not seeking the kind of decisive battles that Bushido demanded. Instead, they were methodically dismantling Japanese power through a strategy of calculated neglect, transforming what should have been strengths into crippling weaknesses, turning fortresses into open-air prisons. The true measure of defeat was not being recorded in lists of casualties, but rather in manifests of supply ships that would never reach their destinations, in airfields that would never again launch Zeros into combat, in soldiers who would perish not from American ammunition, but from tropical diseases, malnutrition, and strategic meaninglessness. The defensive posture that Japan had adopted across the Pacific had been conceived in the conference rooms of Imperial General Headquarters with an elegant symmetry that appealed to the military imagination. Each island strongpoint would function as an unsinkable aircraft carrier, each garrison a dagger pointed at the throat of any American advance. The enemy would have no choice but to assault these prepared positions, hemorrhaging men and materiel against Japanese steel and the indomitable Japanese spirit. Lieutenant General Hideki Tojo himself had made the proclamation in September of 1943 regarding the establishment of what he termed the absolute national defense perimeter, a defensive boundary that would run from the southern portion of Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands, through the Bonins, the Marianas, western New Guinea, then down through Malaya and Burma. Every strongpoint within this perimeter would be defended to the final man. Every island would be converted into an impregnable fortress. The Americans would be forced to purchase every meter of sand with blood. At Rabaul specifically, General Hitoshi Imamura exercised command over 50,000 elite soldiers of the 8th Area Army. The harbour installations were protected by 367 anti-aircraft guns. 5 separate airfields possessed the capacity to launch hundreds of aircraft. The complex incorporated the pre-war Australian airstrips at Lakunai and Vunakanau, while Rapopo had been operational since December of 1942 and featured concrete hardstandings and extensive dispersal areas. Rabaul is impregnable, Imamura had assured Tokyo in November of 1943. The Americans will destroy themselves against our defences like ocean waves shattering against a seawall. What neither Imamura nor the planners at Imperial Headquarters grasped was that the Americans harboured absolutely no intention of granting them their desired climactic battle. The revelation began in June of 1943, initially disguised as a form of victory. When American troops went ashore on Woodlark and Kiriwina Islands on the 30th of June, Japanese commanders initially celebrated the news. These islands had minimal defences. Clearly, the Americans lacked the courage to assault genuine Japanese defensive positions. Captain Toshio Takahashi, serving as intelligence officer at Rabaul, wrote in his analysis that the enemy demonstrated insufficient stomach for serious combat. They nibble at the periphery like mice, terrified of the lion. Yet something in the pattern troubled him deeply. The Americans were not simply selecting easy targets. They were specifically choosing islands where airfield construction was feasible. Woodlark and Kiriwina were positioned perfectly to provide air coverage for operations that had absolutely nothing to do with attacking nearby Japanese strongholds. The sense of unease intensified when American forces conducted their invasion of New Georgia on June 30, 1943. The Japanese had positioned 10,500 troops defending that island, concentrated around the critical airfield at Munda Point. Finally, it seemed, a genuine battle was at hand. But after brutal fighting that extended through August, the Americans secured control of the airfield and then simply halted. They did not pursue the retreating Japanese forces. They made no attempt to clear the entire island of enemy presence. They simply developed Munda and proceeded to their next objective. Major Kenji Hatano, one of the survivors of the New Georgia campaign, reported back to Rabaul with an observation that the Americans conduct warfare differently. They seize what they require and abandon the remainder to us. It is as though our existence is irrelevant to their planning. By November of 1943, the pattern had become horrifyingly apparent. The American offensive, which had been designated Operation Cartwheel, was not designed to capture Japanese installations. It was designed to render them strategically meaningless. Admiral Minichi Koga, serving as Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, had responded to the Allied landing on Bougainville by rushing carrier aircraft to Rabaul's defense. On the 1st of November in 1943, he transferred 173 carrier aircraft from the carriers Zuikaku, Shokaku, Zuiho, Junyo, Hio and Ryuho to reinforce Rabaul. These aircraft included 82 Zeros, 45 Type 99 dive bombers, 40 Type 97 torpedo bombers, and 6 reconnaissance aircraft. More critically, these represented Japan's remaining pool of trained carrier pilots. The irreplaceable veterans who had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor, who had savaged British forces at Ceylon, who had fought at Midway. They constituted the cutting edge of Japanese naval aviation, now committed to defending a base that the Americans had already determined was not worth attacking. The American response arrived with devastating swiftness. On November 5th, carrier aircraft from USS Saratoga and USS Princeton struck Rabaul, inflicting heavy damage on 4 heavy cruisers and 2 light cruisers. On November 11th, they returned with reinforcements from Essex, Bunker Hill and Independence, damaging most of the remaining warships. But the truly devastating aspect was what transpired next. The Americans did not invade. They did not exploit their advantage. They simply departed, having destroyed 121 of the 173 carrier aircraft, along with a significant portion of the irreplaceable aircrew. Commander Yasuo Kuwahara, a Zero pilot who survived the November battles, wrote in a letter that was discovered after the war that we achieved victory. We drove them away. Then why does it feel as though we have been defeated? They damaged our vessels, shot down our aircraft, and sailed away. We cannot pursue them. We cannot strike back. We can only wait for their return. Lieutenant Commander Toshikazu Omai, serving as Senior Staff Officer of the Southeast Area Fleet, began maintaining meticulous documentation of what the bypass strategy meant in concrete terms. His classified reports, which were captured following the war, provide a mathematically precise chronicle of strategic strangulation. In November of 1943, Rabaul was receiving 30,000 tons of supplies on a monthly basis. Fuel reserves stood at 60% of capacity. Ammunition stocks were adequate for 6 months of sustained combat operations. By December of 1943, supply convoys were encountering increasing difficulty. American submarines were sinking 2 vessels for every single one that managed to reach port. monthly deliveries had declined to 18,000 tons. In January of 1944, no surface vessels had successfully reached Rabaul in 3 weeks. Only submarine deliveries were getting through, providing a mere 2,000 tons that month. Fuel reserves had declined to 30%. By February of 1944, the Japanese High Command made the determination to cease provisioning Rabaul with fighters or bombers, acknowledging the futility of reinforcing an isolated garrison that could no longer effectively employ such assets. The mathematics were relentless and unforgiving. Without continuous resupply, even the most powerful fortress transforms into a prison. Captain Takeo Takagi, in command of a destroyer squadron stationed at Rabaul, confronted an impossible equation. He possessed sufficient fuel for perhaps one major sortie. But where would he proceed? The Americans had seized the Admiralty Islands in February of 1944, completing the encirclement of Rabaul. Every possible direction led into enemy-controlled waters. "We have become a fleet that cannot put to sea," he wrote, "warriors incapable of fighting. We maintain the pretense of being a threat while the actual war proceeds without us." What the Americans had discovered, whether through brilliant strategic planning or fortunate accident, was that Japanese island garrisons could be defeated by the Pacific environment itself. Each bypassed island became a green hell where the jungle, disease, and starvation accomplished the work that would otherwise require entire infantry divisions. Dr. Shigaki Yamauchi, serving as chief medical officer at Rabaul, documented the gradual dissolution of combat effectiveness. In December of 1943, malaria cases were increasing, but medical supplies remained adequate. Quinine reserves would last 4 months. Combat readiness stood at 85%. By March of 1944, 30% of the garrison was suffering from malaria, dengue fever, or dysentery. Quinine had been completely exhausted. They were attempting to use local bark substitutes with extremely limited effectiveness. Combat readiness had declined to 60%. The Americans had weaponized time itself. Every day that elapsed weakened the Japanese garrisons, while American forces grew progressively stronger, leaping from island to island, constructing airfields and port facilities, creating an infrastructure of victory while Japanese strongholds rotted in tropical isolation. On Wake Island, which had been bypassed since October of 1943, Captain Shigematsu Sakaibara commanded approximately 4,000 Japanese troops. Once a vital refueling station for trans-Pacific flights, Wake had been transformed into a fortress bristling with coastal artillery, anti-aircraft weapons, and underground bunker complexes. The Americans simply ignored its existence. Sakaibara would eventually be promoted to Rear Admiral in October of 1944, but by that point his command had already become strategically irrelevant. Sakaibara's reports to Tokyo, transmitted using radio components delivered by submarine, grew increasingly desperate in tone. In November of 1943, enemy carrier aircraft struck our installations. We are awaiting the invasion force. All positions are manned and prepared. By January of 1944, no invasion has materialized. Enemy ships pass by on a weekly basis, beyond the range of our coastal guns. We request instructions. By April of 1944, the food situation has become critical. Fishing provides some relief, but proves insufficient for the garrison. Many men are showing clear signs of malnutrition. When will relief arrive? On Wolei Atoll in the Caroline Islands, 6,426 Japanese troops under Major General Katsumi Kitamura experienced a similar abandonment. The Americans had seized nearby islands for airfield construction, but left Wolei's garrison to wither on the vine. Kitamura's diary, which was recovered following the war, chronicles the psychological disintegration in painful detail. On March 31, 1944, the enemy task force sailed past again today, close enough that we could observe them through binoculars, yet beyond reach of our artillery. They do not even consider us worth the effort of destruction. On May 15, 1944, We received a radio message stating that all available forces are being concentrated for the decisive battle. We are not included in these plans. We have become military orphans. By August 2nd, 1944, the men have commenced cultivating gardens. This is not the work of warriors, but survival demands it. I fear we are transforming into farmers rather than soldiers. The American carrier raids that periodically struck bypassed bases served purposes beyond inflicting military damage. They functioned as psychological operations designed to remind Japanese garrisons of their utter helplessness. At Truk, which Japanese strategists considered the Gibraltar of the Pacific, approximately 27,000 troops, and the Fourth Fleet had created what was believed to be an impregnable bastion. On February 17th through 18th of 1944, during what was designated Operation Hailstone, the US Navy's Fast Carrier Task Force conducted massive air raids that destroyed over 250 aircraft, sank 2 light cruisers, 4 destroyers, and 32 merchant ships totaling 200,000 tons, while killing 4,500 Japanese personnel. Vice Admiral Masami Kobayashi, commanding at Truk, experienced every commander's worst nightmare, which was not defeat but irrelevance. His report to Combined Fleet Headquarters revealed the psychological impact with brutal clarity. The American carriers materialized from nowhere, struck with overwhelming force, and vanished. We could not pursue. We could not retaliate. We could only endure and repair the damage, knowing with certainty they will return when they choose. This is not warfare as we understand it. It is torment. The pattern replicated itself across the Pacific. Marcus Island, Palau, Yap, each received attention from American carriers just frequently enough to prevent any coherent defensive planning, yet never enough to provide the honorable battle that Japanese commanders desperately craved. The fall of Saipan in July of 1944 provided the most devastating proof of the island-hopping strategy's effectiveness. When American forces came ashore on June 15, 1944, they brought overwhelming force totaling over 300,000 men transported in more than 500 ships. But what terrified Japanese strategists was not the assault on Saipan itself. It was the catalogue of fortresses the Americans had not bothered to assault. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, commanding the defense of Saipan, received his final situation report on July 6, 1944, immediately before his final Banzai charge. It catalogued the Empire's paralyzed forces with devastating precision. Truk held 27,000 troops, isolated, with no naval support possible. Rabaul held 100,000 troops, isolated, reduced to agricultural production. Wake held 4,000 troops, isolated, surviving on fishing. Marcus held 4,000 troops, isolated, with water shortages reaching critical levels. Woliai held 6,426 troops, isolated, with starvation imminent. Over 200,000 Japanese troops, equipped with thousands of tons of ammunition, hundreds of aircraft, and elaborate fortification systems, sat completely helpless while the Americans drove steadily toward Japan itself. These were not casualties in any conventional sense. They were something far worse. They were military assets that had been transformed into strategic liabilities. When Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi arrived at Iwo Jima in June of 1944, he brought with him a revolutionary understanding born from observing the island-hopping campaign. He immediately recognized that Iwo Jima could not be successfully defended. The Americans will surely invade this island on their route to the Japanese mainland, and the timing of their assault will be very soon. Unlike his predecessors who had planned for victory, Kuribayashi planned for the most effective possible defeat. He had studied what transpired at bypassed garrisons and understood the strategic calculus with perfect clarity. Rather than establishing beach defences to contest the landings directly, he opted for defence in depth, ordering the construction of 18 kilometres of tunnels and 5,000 cave positions beneath the island's surface. In a letter to his wife that would only be delivered following his death, Kuribayashi explained his strategy with brutal honesty. I do not fight to achieve victory. That is impossible. I fight to make the Americans pay such a price that they will reconsider before invading Japan. Every Marine we kill here is one who cannot participate in the invasion of the homeland. We are not defending Iwo Jima. We are defending Japan with our deaths. This represented a fundamental transformation in Japanese military thinking. Kuribayashi explicitly prohibited Banzai charges until the final days, considering them wasteful, and ordered every soldier to fight for as long as possible before being killed. The island-hopping strategy had taught Japanese commanders that heroic death meant absolutely nothing if it failed to serve a strategic purpose. What Japanese commanders gradually realized was that the Americans had revolutionized warfare itself. The island-hopping strategy was not simply about avoiding strong points. It was about creating an entirely new form of military logistics that rendered traditional defensive positions obsolete. Commander Chihaya Takahashi, a staff officer who analyzed American operations, wrote a report that was suppressed by Imperial headquarters. The Americans do not capture islands in the traditional sense. They create floating bases. Each captured atoll becomes a fuel depot. Each lagoon becomes a harbor. Each airstrip becomes a projection of power. They have transformed the Pacific Ocean itself into a highway for their war machine. Liberty ships were being produced at a rate of 3 vessels per day at peak production. While Japanese garrisons carefully rationed their final tons of rice, American construction battalions were pouring concrete for runways capable of handling 100-ton bombers. Captain Minoru Genda, the tactical genius behind the Pearl Harbor attack, studied American logistics from his post in Tokyo and reached a chilling conclusion. We prepared for a war of warriors. They are fighting a war of engineers. While we perfect the art of dying, they perfect the art of supply. Each bypassed garrison weakens us. Each new airfield strengthens them. Time itself has become our enemy. Complementing the island-hopping strategy was the American submarine campaign that transformed Japanese resupply efforts into suicide missions. By 1944, American submarines were sinking Japanese vessels at a rate that exceeded replacement capacity. Admiral Naokuni Nomura, commanding submarine operations from Truk, documented the impossibility of supporting bypassed garrisons. In January of 1944, we lost I-169 while attempting to resupply the Bougainville garrison. 40 tons of supplies were lost with her. In February of 1944, I-43 was damaged by aircraft while approaching Rabaul. The mission was aborted. In March of 1944, I-42 was sunk while attempting to evacuate key personnel from Wake Island. By April of 1944, submarine resupply missions were suspended indefinitely. We cannot justify the loss of boats for minimal supply delivery. The submarines that had once served as the lifeline for bypassed garrisons became too precious to risk on such missions. Each isolated fortress was truly alone. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944 demonstrated the fatal consequences of the island-hopping strategy on Japanese naval aviation. Japan had already sacrificed 121 of 173 veteran carrier pilots defending Rabaul, stripping the carrier fleet of its most experienced aviators. The carriers were now filled with inexperienced pilots, many possessing less than 100 hours of flight time. The veteran instructors who should have trained them were either dead or trapped on bypassed islands. The result was what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot on June 19th through 20th of 1944. Japanese losses included 5 150 to 645 aircraft destroyed, 3 fleet carriers sunk, those being Taiho, Shokaku and Hiyo, with approximately 3,000 personnel killed. American losses totaled 123 aircraft and 109 personnel killed. The 10-to-1 kill ratio reflected not merely American superiority, but Japanese degradation resulting directly from the bypass strategy. In his after-action report, Admiral Ozawa wrote with devastating honesty that we possess carriers without pilots, pilots without experience, and experience without any opportunity to acquire it. The enemy's strategy has not simply defeated us, it has made it impossible for us to become capable of achieving victory. By mid-1944, a surreal transformation was occurring throughout the bypassed Japanese garrisons. Elite combat units that had trained for years in the art of war were becoming agricultural communes struggling merely to survive. On Rabaul, General Imamura issued orders that would have seemed insane 2 years earlier. Effective immediately, all units will devote 50% of daylight hours to food production. Each soldier must cultivate 100 square meters of vegetables. Unit commanders will be evaluated based on agricultural yield rather than combat readiness. Imamura ordered the cultivation of fields to accumulate harvests, recognizing that the Americans had chosen blockade over invasion. The fortress of Rabaul, constructed to threaten Allied operations across the entire Pacific, had been transformed into an enormous prison farm. Colonel Norio Kishimoto, commanding an infantry regiment, wrote in his diary that my samurai ancestors would weep to witness us. We who trained to die gloriously in battle now tend sweet potatoes and raise chickens. The Americans have not simply defeated us, they have humiliated us through irrelevance. Similar scenes played out across the Pacific theatre. On Waleai, soldiers raised pigs. At Truk, they fished with improvised nets. On Wake, they attempted to cultivate vegetables in coral sand mixed with human waste. The Imperial Japanese Army, which had conquered half of Asia, had been reduced to subsistence farming. Perhaps the cruelest aspect of the island-hopping strategy was that it required months or even years for bypassed commanders to fully comprehend their situation. Radio contact with Tokyo continued. Orders were still transmitted. Promotions were still announced. The fiction of military relevance was carefully maintained, even as reality diverged completely. General Imamura at Rabaul continued receiving operational orders from Imperial General Headquarters as late as December of 1944. Prepare for coordinated offensive operations in conjunction with Philippine operations. Maintain readiness to interdict enemy supply lines. The absurdity of such orders, requesting that a garrison which had not seen a supply ship in 8 months conduct offensive operations, reveals the complete disconnection between Japanese High Command's perception and the actual battlefield reality. By April of 1944, the last Japanese submarine had evacuated Rabaul, the last surface vessel had departed, and no aircraft had taken off in over a month. By early 1944, the bypass strategy evolved into its cruelest phase. B-24 bombers periodically struck the gardens that bypassed garrisons had painstakingly cultivated. Fighter sweeps machine-gunned the fishing boats. Even the desperate attempt to survive was systematically denied. Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamaguchi, serving as agricultural officer at Waleai, recorded the devastation. 6 months of labour destroyed in 10 minutes. The corn we nursed from seeds, the vegetables we watered using our drinking rations, all burning. The Americans did not bomb our gun positions or ammunition dumps, they bombed our food. They understand exactly what they are doing. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, approximately 300,000 Japanese troops remained on bypassed islands throughout the Pacific. At Rabaul alone, 69,000 Japanese troops remained when Japan capitulated. These men had survived not through combat but through cultivating gardens, fishing, and slowly starving. The surrender created a surreal situation for many garrisons. Many bypassed units refused to believe the surrender announcement, convinced it represented American propaganda. Others, even accepting its veracity, had no mechanism for surrender. They occupied islands with no American presence whatsoever. Colonel Masashi Yamamoto on Mile Atoll in the Marshall Islands faced this precise dilemma. The war has ended, but we have no one to surrender to. The Americans bypassed us so thoroughly they have forgotten our existence. We must wait for them to remember us. Some garrisons waited weeks or months before American forces arrived to accept their surrender. During this interval, they existed in a strange limbo, no longer at war, yet not yet at peace. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the architect of the Central Pacific Campaign, later reflected on the island-hopping strategy with satisfaction. We learned that the quickest path to defeating Japan was not to fight the Japanese. Every bypassed island represented thousands of soldiers we did not have to kill, tons of ammunition we did not have to expend, American lives we did not have to sacrifice. We turned their strength against them. General Douglas MacArthur, though initially resistant to bypassing major targets, eventually recognized the strategy's brilliance, particularly following the decision to bypass Rabaul, which saved enormous Allied casualties. But perhaps the most revealing assessment came from Admiral Matome Ugaki, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, who wrote in his diary in February of 1945 that the Americans have discovered the perfect strategy against the Japanese warrior spirit. They have rendered our courage irrelevant, our fortifications useless, our Bushido meaningless. We prepared to die gloriously. They sentenced us to live shamefully. This is worse than defeat. This is erasure. The mathematics of the island-hopping strategy reveal its devastating effectiveness with brutal clarity. Japanese forces bypassed included Rabaul with 100,000 troops initially and 69,000 at surrender. Truk held approximately 27,000 troops. Waleai held 6,426 troops, of whom only 1,650 survived to surrender. Wake held 4,000 troops. Marcus held 4,000 troops. Various other garrisons held tens of thousands more. In total, an estimated 300,000 Japanese troops were neutralized without major combat operations. The strategic success rate was absolute. Of the 26 major Japanese bases that were bypassed, not a single one managed to significantly interfere with American operations after being isolated. The island-hopping strategy's greatest triumph was discovering the one thing the Japanese warrior could not fight, which was being ignored. By late 1944, some Japanese commanders began to understand and adapt to the new reality, but it was far too late. Lieutenant General Kuribayashi at Iwo Jima had studied the island-hopping campaign and designed his defense accordingly. Not to achieve victory, but to make victory so costly that Americans would reconsider invading the Japanese home islands. His approach, prohibiting banzai charges, refusing to attempt holding the beaches, fighting from elaborate tunnel systems, represented a complete rejection of traditional Japanese tactics. He had learned from the bypass strategy that the only value of any defensive position was the cost it could inflict on an attacker who chose to attack it. His defense extended what should have been a 5-day battle to 36 days, inflicting nearly 26,000 American casualties, including 6,821 killed. General Holland Smith called Kuribayashi the most formidable of all Pacific adversaries. Similarly, the defense of Okinawa in 1945 showed Japanese adaptation to the lessons learned from island hopping. Instead of attempting to defeat the invasion, defenders sought to make it so costly that America would seek negotiated peace rather than invade Japan proper. The greatest irony of the island-hopping strategy was that it used Japan's own dedication against itself. Every bypassed garrison that refused to surrender, every soldier who chose death over dishonor, every commander who followed orders to hold at all costs became a self-imposed prisoner. The Americans had expected bypassed garrisons to collapse quickly, but many survived far longer than anticipated by cultivating gardens and sometimes working with local populations. This survival, which might have been viewed as admirable resilience, instead merely prolonged their suffering and irrelevance. General Imamura, reflecting after the war, observed that we trapped ourselves with our own code. Surrender was impossible. Retreat was forbidden. So we remained in place. The Americans did not need to defeat us. We defeated ourselves through our inability to adapt to their strategy. For the bypassed garrisons, the war's end brought not relief but profound confusion. At Rabaul, General Imamura and Admiral Kusaka formally surrendered on September 6, 1945, aboard HMS Glory. But they were surrendering forces that had not been militarily relevant for over a year. Many smaller garrisons experienced even stranger endings. On Anatahan Island, 32 Japanese soldiers refused to believe the war had ended and continued fighting against no one until 1951. They maintained strict military discipline, conducted regular patrols, and prepared for an American invasion that had been cancelled 6 years earlier. These holdouts represented the logical extreme of the bypass strategy's psychological impact. So thoroughly had their military purpose been negated that they could not conceive of a world where they simply did not matter anymore. Beyond the strategic implications, the island-hopping strategy inflicted a uniquely cruel form of suffering on Japanese forces. Combat, however terrible, at least offered meaning. Death in service of the emperor, sacrifice for the nation. The bypassed garrisons were denied even this cold comfort. Private Kazuo Sakamaki, stationed at Woleai, wrote that we do not fear death, we fear meaninglessness. Every day we wake up, conduct military drills for battles that will never occur, maintain weapons that will never fire in anger, and pretend we are soldiers when we are actually prisoners of our own making. The medical records from bypassed garrisons reveal the human toll with devastating precision. Malnutrition affected 80% of troops. Disease rates exceeded 60%. Psychological disorders were endemic throughout these garrisons. Suicide rates increased dramatically compared to combat units. The island-hopping strategy fundamentally changed warfare in ways that extended far beyond World War II. It demonstrated conclusively that controlling key geographic points did not necessarily mean controlling a region. Traditional military thinking was completely overturned. The Americans proved you could control the Pacific while systematically ignoring its strong points. The strategy showed that superior supply lines and industrial capacity could negate virtually any tactical advantage. Time became weaponized. By accelerating their own operations while slowing the enemy's, Americans turned the passage of time itself into a strategic advantage. Most importantly, it proved that psychological impact could exceed physical damage in achieving strategic objectives. In 1965, 20 years after the war's conclusion, former General Hitoshi Imamura published his memoirs. After his conviction for war crimes, he had constructed a replica of his prison cell in his garden and lived there until his death in 1968, donating all proceeds from his writings to families of Allied prisoners who had died under his command. His assessment of the island-hopping strategy was both professional and intensely personal. We studied Napoleon, we studied Clausewitz, we studied Sun Tzu. We prepared for every form of warfare we could imagine. But the Americans created a new form we never anticipated. Warfare through avoidance, victory through irrelevance. They transformed our greatest strength, our willingness to die for our positions, into our greatest weakness. At Rabaul, I commanded 100,000 of Japan's finest soldiers. We possessed ammunition for years of combat, fortifications capable of withstanding any assault, and the absolute will to fight to the last man. None of it mattered in the slightest. The Americans sailed past us toward Japan, and we could only observe helplessly. We became an army of ghosts, haunting positions that no longer possessed any significance, defending territory that had lost all value, waiting for battles that would never materialize. This was their genius. They made us defeat ourselves. Every day we maintained our positions, we weakened Japan. Every soldier growing vegetables at Rabaul was one not defending the homeland. We were not defeated through combat, we were erased. Future military leaders should study the American island-hopping strategy not for its tactical brilliance, but for its strategic revolution. It proved that the optimal way to defeat an enemy position is not to attack it, but to render it irrelevant. The optimal way to win a war is to redefine victory itself. We terrified ourselves with our own impotence. We had trained our entire lives for glorious death in combat. the Americans sentenced us to meaningless life in isolation. There exists no warrior code that prepares you for irrelevance. We were warriors from an ancient tradition confronting an enemy from the future. They did not defeat our strategy. They made strategy itself obsolete. This was the true terror of the island-hopping campaign. It demonstrated that everything we believed about warfare was fundamentally wrong. The most poignant testament to the island-hopping strategy's psychological impact came from Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, who continued fighting on Lubang Island in the Philippines until 1974, 29 years after the war ended. Deployed to Lubang on December 26, 1944, with explicit orders never to surrender, Onoda held out with 3 other soldiers until he became the last survivor. On March 9, 1974, his former commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, flew to Lubang and formally relieved him of duty. Onoda surrendered on March 10, 1974, with his rifle still functioning, 500 rounds of ammunition, and his 30-year-old uniform intact. When asked why he had continued so long, Onoda replied that I was waiting for the war to come back to me. I never imagined it would abandon me behind forever. The Japanese were terrified by America's island-hopping strategy because it represented something far worse than defeat. It represented absolute meaninglessness. Every military tradition, every cultural value, every strategic assumption was systematically turned against them. They had prepared for a war of warriors and faced instead a war of engineers and logisticians who treated their island fortresses like obstacles to be driven around rather than enemies to be fought. Approximately 300,000 Japanese troops on bypassed islands did not lose the war. They were written out of it entirely. While they maintained their positions, cultivated their gardens, and slowly starved, the war simply moved on without them. They were not conquered through force of arms, they were discarded, they were not defeated in battle, they were ignored. In his final entry before Japan's surrender, Admiral Kusaka at Rabaul wrote with bitter clarity that the Americans have taught us the cruelest lesson of warfare, that there exists something worse than death in battle. Irrelevance in victory. We were the Emperor's finest warriors, reduced to growing sweet potatoes while the enemy sailed past us toward the homeland. We were prepared to die gloriously. Instead, we lived meaninglessly. This was their ultimate weapon. Not bombs or bullets, but obsolescence itself. The island-hopping strategy succeeded because it attacked not Japanese positions, but Japanese purpose, not bodies, but beliefs, not fortifications, but fundamental assumptions about the very nature of war itself. It transformed the Pacific Ocean from a field of battle into a highway to victory and converted Japanese strongholds from fortresses into prisons of their own making. The terror it inspired came not from what it did, but from what it refused to do. It did not provide the battle Japanese warriors craved. It did not validate their sacrifice. It did not even acknowledge their existence. It simply passed them by, leaving them to discover that the worst fate for any warrior is not death, but irrelevance. The warriors of the Empire of the Rising Sun discovered that the setting sun casts the longest shadows, and in those shadows, forgotten armies slowly faded into nothing, defeated not by their enemies, but by their absence. They had witnessed the future of warfare, and in that future they had no place whatsoever.